Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tara Whitzel, and I will be your host from ERDC's Ecological Resources Branch, and I'm glad that you could join me for today's webinar opportunity. Before we jump in, I have just a few notes to mention. As you have questions throughout the presentation, please use the chat feature and send your question to everyone, and then we'll go ahead and answer those at the end of the presentation. At that time, I'll invite you to either unmute your line and ask your question verbally, or you can continue to use the chat feature. I want to let everyone know that I am recording this webinar, and I will share a link to the presentation files following the meeting. And you, of course, are welcome to share those resources with colleagues that are unable to join us during the live meeting. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce our topic and speakers. Our webinar topic today is the use of USACE reservoirs as stopover sites for the Aransas-Wood buffalo population of whooping crane. Today's presentation summarizes the use of USACE reservoirs as spring and fall migration stopover sites for the endangered Aransas-Wood buffalo population of whooping cranes. Researchers involved in this study assessed whooping crane stopover at USACE reservoirs within the migration flyway using data primarily from a study by the U.S. Geological Survey and collaborators that incorporated data from satellite transmitters on 68 whooping cranes during 2009 to 2018. Our speakers today are Drs. Jung and Richard Fisher from the Engineer Research Development Center. Jacob Jung is a research wildlife biologist in the Environmental Laboratory Ecological Resources Branch at ERDC, and he is part of the wildlife team. His background is focused on ornithology, threatened and endangered species conservation, habitat management, and wildlife monitoring. And Dr. Richard Fisher is a research wildlife biologist in the Ecological Resources Branch at ERDC. He has served as president of the National Military Fish and Wildlife Association and currently is the EL Wildlife Team Leader, the National Coordinator for the Department of Defense Bird Conservation Program, and lead for the USACE Threatened and Endangered Species team. At this point, I'll turn our presentation over to our speakers, and thank you very much for joining us today. Dr. Jung?
Hey, thanks, Tara. This is Rich Fisher. I'll actually start the presentation, and then I'll turn it over to Jake for the technical aspects of the presentation. Can you hear me loud and clear?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, well, good. Well, thanks, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Really appreciate everybody joining, and hope you find the presentation interesting, and we look forward to some interaction and questions at the end. Jake and I are really excited to share some hopefully interesting information about the nexus between federally endangered whooping cranes and Corps of Engineers reservoir projects. And I think many of you will be surprised, like we were once we got into looking at the data, to see just how important our reservoirs and associated habitats are to migrating whooping cranes. Many of our lake managers certainly are aware that cranes stop over at our projects, but most of the sightings come incidentally or through eBird. And often birds arrive in the late evening and depart in the early morning before they're detected. So the data that USGS and their partners have shared with us and that Jake will be presenting today is, I think, pretty enlightening. Some of you are also aware of parallel work that Jake and I are doing to support the Army National Guard and the military services as a whole, but we're also working in parallel on whooping crane conservation for Army Corps of Engineers Civil Works projects. And today's presentation will focus almost exclusively on civil works. Next slide, please, Jake. So a little bit of background. The whooping crane is federally protected and listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. And while there are some experimental populations of whooping cranes that have been established, The Aransas-Wood buffalo population is the only wild migratory population and is the focus of our investigation. So this population breeds and nests and rears young in Wood Buffalo National Park in Canada. It winters primarily at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge on the Gulf Coast of Texas, though there is some wintering outside of the refuge that we may discuss later. So this means that birds migrate about 2,500 miles through 7 states between breeding and wintering ranges. And we'll talk specifically today about what happens during migration, specifically on Corps of Engineers projects. The population is currently estimated at 504 individuals. If we look historically, back kind of pre-settlement, before Europeans settled on the continent, it's estimated there were about 10,000 whooping cranes. And through various sources and stressors, including overhunting and loss of habitat, that population decreased from 10,000 to about 1,400 birds by 1870. And that population decline continued into the 1900s, and by 1941, there were only an estimated 15 adults in a single migratory flock. Since that time, significant conservation and management of cranes and their habitat by a wide variety of federal and non-federal partners has elevated that population size, and in particular over the last 10 years or so. So right now we stand somewhere around 500 adults in that wild migratory population. Next slide. So like I said, the total migration length is about 2,500 miles, but birds don't make those flights start to finish in one fell swoop. They kind of leapfrog their way up and down the U.S. and Canada between their seasonal ranges. And birds average about 150 to 200 miles between stopover sites. And those stopover sites consist primarily of rivers and riparian areas, grain fields, and in particular shallow water wetlands. And those stopover sites and the quality of those sites is really important because birds have to replenish their energy reserves in order to make those migration events. As they move towards their breeding ranges, the females have to gather enough energy and nutrition to lay eggs and certainly to incubate and rear young. As they move from South Texas up to Canada, those spring migration events take on average 29 days. And as they complete their breeding and nesting and brood rearing duties up north and begin migrating back to winter range, that fall migration is a bit more protracted. Birds on average take about 45 days to complete their fall migration. Next slide. So about 5 years ago, Mr. Chester McConnell from a nonprofit called Friends of the Wild Whoopers contacted me about what the Corps of Engineers and the DoD military services are doing to support crane conservation and what the status of our habitat was within our boundaries. And at the time, I really didn't have a solid answer for Chester, but he was convinced that our projects, civil works projects and military installations were actually quite important and much more important than most of us thought. And so through some really diligent work by Jeremy Crossland at Corps Headquarters, Mr. David Hoover, who is recently retired from the Kansas City District, and Mike Bichelli in the North Atlantic Division, the Corps of Engineers was able to sign a memorandum of understanding with the Friends of the Wild Whoopers in 2018. And that was really a landmark MOU for us in terms of being able to launch out and do some really interesting work on cranes on Corps lakes. And the purpose of the MOU was to really address water resources challenges relative to cranes and to actively pursue the protection, the restoration, the enhancement of whooping crane habitat, and particularly during the stopover events as birds move between their seasonal ranges. Next slide. So Chester McConnell and his colleagues at Friends of the Wild Whoopers began conducting site visits to military installations and civil works projects back in 2016, even before we had an MOU in place. And the purpose of these site visits was to meet with natural resources managers to look at the resource and really determine where potential stopover habitat existed and how we might actually manage to enhance habitat and also to reduce some potential disturbances. For many of these site visits, David Hoover from Kansas City District accompanied Chester and his colleagues and really significantly helped to kind of move things forward with getting out to these projects and doing these assessments. David, I know you're on the call and I know you're retired, but thanks for all your help and look forward to talking with you more in the future. But anyway, most of these site visits were funded out of Chester's personal funds. But for some of the more recent visits, the Corps' Threatened and Endangered Species Team initiative helped support some of the travel costs. So that was a great thing for Chester and for David. And this was really a good opportunity for our resources managers to get out with experts and discuss habitat management. And until last year, we really had no real data other than some incidental information to show actual habitat use by cranes on our projects. Next slide. So Friends of the Wild Whippers were able to visit about 25 core reservoir projects and about 7 military installations, all within the migration flyway. And really importantly, for each one of these site visits, Chester McConnell generated detailed reports that identified existing stopover habitat and ways to maintain or improve that habitat, and also identify areas where minor actions could be implemented to create potentially new stopover habitat. And so we have those reports available for each one of Chester's site visits if anyone's interested in seeing those. Next slide. This is just a summary of some of the recommendations for stopover habitat made by Friends of the Wild Whippers. These are things that we're keying in on in some of our current work and some of the things we're proposing to do in the future. Jake will talk a little bit more about that as we get into more in-depth discussion about the presentation. Next slide. At the same time that Chester McConnell and Friends of the Wild Whippers were conducting assessments and we had an MOU in place, Jake and I took a significant interest in helping to support the overall conservation effort through funding from the Corps of Engineers Threatened and Endangered Species Team. The Corps of Engineers has responsibility for more than 300 federally listed species on our projects, over 450 civil works reservoir projects, and we often spend in excess of $200 million annually for conservation and compliance. And along with these really massive expenditures, we experience significant mission impacts and in many cases, loss of operational flexibility, often through compliance with biological opinions. And so the Threatened and Endangered Species Team was established and designed to address these high expenditures and these significant mission impacts and to look for solutions to reduce costs and increase operational flexibility. And until very recently, the Corps had no formal strategy for kind of assessing and prioritizing or addressing threatened and endangered species issues. And listed species have put many of our district and division offices in a reactionary posture through compliance with biological opinions and addressing restrictive environmental windows. And we saw that we really needed a better way of addressing listed species issues within the agency, and particularly with those that are costly or have high mission impacts. Next slide. So something that we have really focused on over the last 4 or 5 years is kind of a little known section of the Endangered Species Act, and that's Section 7A1. 7A1 is a section of the Act that addresses proactive conservation and recovery needs of listed species relative to our federal programs. And 7A1 is designed to increase listed species baselines using agency authorities. It allows us to work continually with Fish and Wildlife Service or National Marine Fisheries Service to develop programs for species conservation that use all of our authorities, all the authorities that the Corps of Engineers has. And actions under 7A1 are not necessarily tied to a particular project for implementation. So it's a tool that can be invoked at any time and used nearly anywhere as a proactive approach. So under 7A1, we commit to doing actions that we would very likely be predisposed to undertake anyway under 7A2 or formal consultation. And it may also reduce the likelihood of future complications during formal consultation, and certainly has the opportunity to reduce jeopardy biological opinions. So under 7A1, one of our big goals is to develop conservation plans that are formal documents that specify long-term management strategies for species conservation, allow us to work within our authorities and available funding, and have the goal of moving species towards recovery. And as such, we intend on developing a 7A1 plan for whooping cranes within DoD as a whole to capture both the military services and the Corps of Engineers Civil Works projects. And in fact, that plan is already being drafted. You see there on the slide the conservation plan for 3 species in the lower Mississippi River. That is a 7A1 conservation plan that was formally developed in coordination with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and that, along with other plans throughout the range of the interior lease turn, were instrumental in helping to achieve recovery and the eventual removal of the interior lease turn from Endangered Species Act protection earlier this year. So we have a good success story and a good framework to follow, and we're trying to use that and apply it to many other species that impact the Corps of Engineers. So one last slide for me, Jake. Just quickly on expenditures by the Corps of Engineers on whooping cranes. So since 2005, we have expended about $12.5 million on whooping cranes. About half of those expenditures have gone to things like species protection, direct habitat management, habitat creation, et cetera. About 17%, a little over $2 million, has gone to inventory and monitoring. But importantly, less than 1% has gone to research, and that 1% is mainly to the analyses associated with this project and our subsequent publications. And as we move forward, we really need to begin linking habitat management and monitoring together through focused research efforts that identify and commit the Corps of Engineers to proactive conservation, proactive management, and also monitoring of whooping cranes. So with that introduction, I will turn it over to Jake to talk more specifically about the study and the data that we used in some of our results. Take it away, Jake.
Great. Thanks, Rich, for that introduction. So, like Rich mentioned, this kind of all originated based on a really large study that came out of USGS along with several other partners, Fish and Wildlife Service, the Canadian Wildlife Service, on actually marking cranes and attaching satellite transmitters that gave us a huge data set of locations to look at. And so Jeremy Crosland, the program manager for Land Use and Natural Resources, was gracious enough to fund us to be able to look a little bit deeper into that data source and apply it to occurrence records at core reservoirs. And so that's what we'll discuss today. And so first thing I want to do is, like I said, acknowledge the USGS and all of their partners, because certainly everything that I present here today would not be possible without that monumental study that they conducted over around a 10-year period, which began at the end of 2009, where they first started marking cranes. Only 2 individuals in that year, but really from 2010 to 2014 is when they marked the majority of whooping cranes. And then they ceased marking cranes in 2016, and then those transmitters stayed active through 2018. But in total, there were 68 whooping cranes marked over that period, and they generated north of 165,000 locations within the public accessible database, and that's really mostly on the ground locations, not including the flight records, any of those records that were erroneous and thrown out. So just an incredibly large data set to be able to work with. Over 2,000 of those records we were able to link to within 1 mile of core reservoirs, and 1,800 of those records directly within the reservoir boundaries as stopover habitat locations. So these transmitters collected quite a bit of data. Of course, the major thing that we were interested in are the actual locations and coordinates of the cranes. There was a filtering process that was conducted by the USGS as far as the precision of these locations, and they varied from less than 10 meters accuracy to out to about 100 meters accuracy. And so then it really gives us a good idea of where these cranes are occurring within our reservoirs. Each crane was individually marked, both, of course, with the satellite transmitter, but also with unique color bands for subsequent identification even after the transmitters failed. They also collected date and time information and season. So here we're primarily concerned with the spring and the fall migration. Like I said, 165,000 locations mostly are ground locations, but within the larger data set, of course, it also collected altitude, direction of movement, and speed to help with that filtering process. I do want to mention 2 other data sources that we did use within our analyses. The first of those came from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service database, the Cooperative Whooping Crane Tracking Project, and that is housed within the Nebraska Ecological Service Office. So with user agreement, that also is available for use. The records within that database are much smaller and rely on mostly observational data from whether it's the service themselves or reliable sources from the public, but around 3,500 records between 1975 to 2019 when we looked at all the records. But that is a continuing database. And around 326 of those fell within the boundaries of core reservoirs. And the last data source that we used was USGS's Biodiversity Information Serving Our Nation, better known as BISON, which provided us another 300 records at core reservoirs. Most of these records within the BISON database are linked to eBird locations. And so I do want to mention some, precautions with these 2 sources compared to the larger telemetry data set, and that most of these do lack precise GPS locations. There are some GPS locations within the Fish and Wildlife Service database. And then the other is just the nature in which the data is collected with an observational bias moving towards where the public is actually able to access. So there's a lot of missing locations within these databases that are captured within the larger telemetry set. And so this table here represents the 68 marked whooping cranes with, like I said, the first 2 individuals in 2009, but the majority of those marked in 2010 to 2014. And so you can see in 2011 through 2014 that over 10% of the population were fitted with transmitters. And this may not seem like much, but for 10% or more of an entire population to be marked is really almost unheard of. And so what this equates to is really allowing us to make some strong inferences on what the remainder of the population is likely doing across the landscape. Another thing to keep in mind is that whooping cranes often travel in groups, so it's likely that the representation for cranes is much higher even than what's represented here in this table. So like Rich mentioned, many of our lake managers may be unaware that cranes even stop over, and that's partly due to the nature of them coming in late in the evening towards dusk and then departing the next morning without the opportunity for observation. So this data set really helps to fill those gaps for those that aren't aware that they do stop over. But Wilson Lake pictured here is one example where we do have really good records of knowing that there is stopover events. And so we hope to use these marked cranes to assist in our understanding of both where and when stopovers do occur at our core reservoirs, and then to continue using this data to eventually dig in a little bit deeper with learning more about habitat requirements at these spots. So now that we've looked at where whooping crane locations are coming from the three data sets, now let's look at the migration corridor itself that we used within the analyses. So the figure here on the left represents the overall migration corridor with the boundaries determined from the outermost stopover sites. And so this is basically taking a minimum convex polygon approach, which is going to give you really the maximum coverage. However, you'll notice that most of the activity is actually more towards the center of that polygon that's outlined in red. The figure on your right comes from additional study by the USGS led by Aaron Pierce again in 2018 that refined it more towards core areas, and that's what's highlighted there, with the green being the 50% core area, purple 75%, and the red 95%. So the majority of migration events occur within that green highlighted area, and that's calculated based on a statistical approach with the 50% core area falling between the 25th and 75th percentile on the x-axis, or better known as east to west. So if you're wondering, there are approximately 102 core reservoirs within the larger migration corridor. And these lakes occur throughout the entire flyway, as you can see here. We did use all three databases for spatial locations for the analyses and considered any observations, like I said, within 1 mile of the reservoir boundary as potential use of the site. We determined a single stopover event from the USGS telemetry database according to the arrival and departure time and date for each of the marked whooping cranes that occurred at each reservoir during either the spring or the fall of each year. And then we focused most of our subsequent analyses on the USGS telemetry database, as the other two databases were lacking some of that precise location data as well as some of the observational biases that I mentioned. We did summarize the data from all the stopover events for each of the reservoirs and by season, fall and spring, according to the number of individual hooping cranes, the total number of stopovers, the total number of stopover days and nights, the average number of stopover days and nights, the minimum and maximum number of days of stopover, and then just the general observational range throughout the season that we observed. So we'll dive into some of the specifics here in a minute, but just as a general overview across the core reservoirs, they are used at a relatively high rate in some instances with important stopover habitat during migration. Another thing to note is one of our reservoirs, Granger Lake, also served as wintering habitat outside of Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. So looking at the map, the white dots represented those reservoirs in which at least one stopover event from whooping cranes was reported. So to break it down a little bit further, you can see that approximately a third of all core lakes in the overall migration corridor were used as a stopover site for hooping cranes. But if we look just at the 50% core area, and that was that area highlighted in green, the main migration route, we see that it had 100% usage among the 14 core reservoirs that occur in that area, so really outstanding. And then if we look at all three of the core areas combined over the 10-year period, we see nearly 75% usage. Now, that's not to say that every single year that percentage is achieved, but at least within the 10-year record, that's the statistics for it. Many of these, though, are used year to year. And so just a few more broad statistics. As far as those, like I mentioned, that are most frequented within the migration, include 4 of our reservoirs towards the north in North Dakota and South Dakota along the Missouri River, as well as a few others, Lake Wilson, Gray Salt Plains, Waurika, and Lake Whitney. I'll highlight Great Salt Plains multiple times just because it received by far the most stopover events within the database, with at least 35 individually marked cranes stopping here at some point within the study, resulting in 130 days at that particular reservoir. So looking at the map here, you can see how the core reservoirs within the hooping crane stopover events are distributed throughout the flyway, including the 14 reservoirs I mentioned within that 50% core area. If we rank the district by number of stopover events, we see that the Tulsa district actually had the highest at 72 events across 7 reservoirs. Next was the Omaha district with 64 events and 5 reservoirs. Then Fort Worth at 57 events, but you'll notice that it actually had the highest number of reservoirs with 9. And then finally the Kansas City district with 24 events and 5 reservoirs. And one thing to mention, looking at this map, those are blown up inserts on the right, with the yellow corresponding to the yellow box in the left side of the map. Same thing for that area in Texas, highlighted in red. So I do want to point out a few more of those really important reservoirs that had more usage, more so than others. And the first set I've already mentioned, and that's those 4 reservoirs along the Missouri River. And Chester McConnell and Friends of the Wild Whoopers have done a great job and visited a few of these reservoirs, outlining some of the sandbars and other areas within the reservoirs that serve as really important stopover habitat. The next one I'll outline is Wilson Lake, and it's around 250 miles south of Lewis and Clark Lake, the final one along the Missouri River stretch. And this is important because, Rich mentioned it's around 150 to 200 miles for a daily migration event. And so this is a little bit beyond that, but not unheard of. And in rare instances, cranes have been known to migrate almost 1,000 kilometers in a day. So that's certainly not the usual case, but it's not far out to see a 250-mile-a-day event. So a critical stepping stone as they're heading south or north between those 2 reservoirs. The next one is, of course, Great Salt Plains Lake that I've already mentioned, with most birds stopping at some point at this particular reservoir. If we move further south, moving from Great Salt Plains down to Waurika, it's around 150 to 175 miles between these. And then one of the last major stops before they hit their wintering grounds at Aransas is Whitney Lake. And you can see there 27 stopover events with some of the other lakes, Waco, Belton, Granger, all within that general area. So a really important stepping stone before they make that last push to Aransas. But what I want to point out here is that if you look at these, they all kind of form nice stepping stones between one reservoir to the other in order to make the entire migration north and south each year. And so now I want to move away from looking kind of from the population as a whole and actually highlight an example of an individual crane's migration. And so this particular example focuses on whooping crane mark D31. And this transmitter lasted 3 years, so we got quite a bit of data out of this particular individual. And you'll notice that for at least 2 of the reservoirs, Great Salt Plains and Canopolis, it actually stopped over during both the fall and the spring migration. And during the fall migration at both of these, it stopped over for 3 years. If you look at Canopolis during the fall, a total of 19 stopover nights, so a significant amount. And so this also represents areas where individual cranes may show to some degree site fidelity, though I will say in general it's not thought to be common within whooping cranes, but at least in some instances they definitely do tend to stop at the same areas. And so I will highlight a couple of reservoirs now before we wrap up. And so once again, I'll mention Great Salt Plains. just to highlight it one last time. And if you're interested, our report when it comes out, which it's in internal review right now and hopefully will be actually published and released soon. But each one of these tables and figures here are within the appendix of all the core reservoirs that were visited by hooping cranes. Like I said, I'm just highlighting those that had more events within the presentation. But that will be posted once it's published on our test website, and there's a link to that site at the end of the presentation. And so Great Salt Plains is somewhat unique as well, and that 32,000 acres of Great Salt Plains National Wildlife Refuge borders the northern part of the lake. There's also a state park situated along the boundaries as well, which afford quite a bit of protection here, along with proper water depth. But the Corps does maintain the dam and spillway here, which you can see during the fall. It seems to have more usage than the spring, though both seasons do experience a high degree. 97 stopovers during the fall, and as Rich mentioned, fall migration does typically last a little bit longer, more spread out, and longer stopover events at a particular location. And so that's kind of exhibited here at Salt Plains as well. And at least one example of a crane stopping over, they did stay at this particular reservoir for 2 weeks before migrating on. And then the final reservoir that I'll single out that I mentioned earlier is Granger Lake. And that's because it differs from all the other core reservoirs in that it actually serves as wintering habitat and not just migratory stopover. And this is mostly during the years of 2013, 2012, when this region and really throughout the flyway had drought conditions. And so the cranes that did actually use this as wintering habitat first migrated to Aransas and then actually migrated back north, where they spent most of the winter here at Granger. And so this may be a really important reservoir as we move forward with both an increasing population size, at least we hope, as space becomes more limited for Aransas, and then especially during drought years where cranes begin to spread out and conditions are not as suitable elsewhere. And so where do we go from here? We've really only touched the surface within the database of what it can provide with all these locational records. And so we want to continue monitoring for whooping cranes at our reservoirs, continue to work with Friends of the Wild Whoopers and Chester at visiting some of the reservoirs that haven't actually had, on-the-ground observation yet. And hopefully this presentation and the results that are in the associated tech report will help guide those future efforts. Also use it to develop that 7A1 plan and finalize it. Like Rick said, it's underway as we speak. To update project operational management plans to assist in whooping crane recovery. Further implement habitat management and management plans at our individual reservoirs, and then just as an overall goal, work towards those goals of the International Whooping Crane Recovery Plan. And so for our last slide, I do want to make you aware of some efforts that are underway. The first one is that there's a second effort for a telemetry set like what I just presented. So they're currently trapping whooping cranes. You can see Dave Brandt, who we've worked with from the USGS in the past, marking one of those cranes at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge. And so we'll have more of those marked birds into the future. And so what this does is provides us a really great opportunity to look at the habitat conditions now, make some habitat improvements, and then with these additional satellite birds, be able to monitor any successes with that habitat management if we do experience additional stopover sites. ERDIC has a proposal in right now with the USGS and Aaron Pierce to look a little bit deeper into some of the information at our reservoirs, particularly lake levels, habitat management around the fringes, and a focus on our reservoirs serving as drought refuge during climate change conditions. And so I'll put out a plug here for any of you that may be on the phone that are associated with some of these reservoirs, the reservoir managers. If you have any data as far as hydrology, lake level management, bathymetry data, we certainly could use your assistance in compiling some of that, especially if our current proposal does move forward. And so we'll be in contact with many of you with that. And then the final thing is we certainly seek to collaborate with the districts and individual reservoirs on any actions taken towards Section 7A1 of the Endangered Species Act. And so before we go to questions, there's quite a few people that really deserve the majority of the credit. Rich and I just took the data that was already out there and just kind of analyzed it relative to core reservoirs. But Aaron Pierce, pictured there on the left with USGS, and the partners on that project really are what made all of this possible. So we'd like to thank them, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Canadian Wildlife Service, the Crane Trust there located in central Nebraska along the Platte, and then the Platte River Recovery Implementation Program. All of those were involved, and I'm sure I'm leaving out some that were responsible for that large satellite telemetry project. We also want to thank Chester McConnell and Pam Bates from Friends of the Wild Whoopers for all of their past, current, and future efforts with the Corps and all the assistance they provided to us. And then finally, all of those lake managers, biologists within the Corps itself. Obviously, you guys have been doing an amazing job of managing these reservoirs and for stopover habitat, or we wouldn't see the numbers that we are experiencing. One person I do want to point out is David Hoover, as Rich mentioned. He's been very instrumental in all of this work, and especially coordination with Friends of the Wild Whoopers. So, David, thank you very much for all your assistance in this program. So before I open it up for questions, you will see the web link there for our test website. And so once the tech report that most of this data is coming from is released, it will be available. We'll also make a PDF version of this PowerPoint available for use if you want to come back and view some of those statistics with the reservoirs. And I thank you for participating and viewing this. And so with that, we'll take any questions.
Yes, this is Tara. At this time, I would invite anyone to unmute and ask your question verbally, or you can put it in the chat. Jake, if it's all right, I do have one question for you. Is there any thought on how to coordinate or make a more consolidated effort across the projects for doing the 7A1 consultation, or not consultation, but coordination?
That's a great question, and I think in order to effectively do 7A1 and create a 7A1 plan, there's going to have to be coordination among the districts, among the projects, and also eventually coordination with the Fish and Wildlife Service. That will primarily fall back on me, this is Rich, by the way, to initiate that coordination. So the plan currently is to develop a draft of that plan and then start sharing that with our colleagues in the various districts and at the projects to get input. And I know that's a significant undertaking, but it's something that we're going to have to do, and we look forward to that coordination with everyone who's involved and interested in whooping crane conservation.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it'll be really exciting to see how that progresses. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And as Jake mentioned, anyone on the line who's currently working with cranes or doing any kind of monitoring or management, we'd love to hear from you. So just shoot us an email or give us a call and let us know what you're doing. That would help us initially in putting the plan together.
I'll invite any other last questions. I'll pause for just a moment, and I will have a reminder that the recording of this presentation, we will make that available on the NRM Gateway, and we'll also coordinate to see if there's an applicability or an avenue to post that on the Threatened and Endangered Species Team site as well. There was a question posted to chat. Do you have any data to know if any non-COE military installations were utilized by cranes during migration?
Hey, Greg, this is Rich. That's a great question. I'll let Jake answer specifically, but yes, in fact, Friends of the Wild Whoopers have visited a number of installations and generated these reports. Jake has the data for the military services. I don't know to what degree he's looked at that, but we will be looking at it. Jake, I'll let you answer in more detail.
Sure. So off the top of my head, I can't give you any specific installations other than I know Fort Hood does have occasionally whooping cranes. Compared to the Corps of Engineers, it's just a fraction of the use. It's very little use among all the military installations, but there are a handful that occasionally get some stopover events. If I had to give you just a estimate right now without actually looking at the data, I would say it's probably fewer than 10 installations, including National Guard installations.
And as a follow-on to that, the primary nexus with the military services is with flight operations. And I can't go into any detail right now, but the Army National Guard in Nebraska is consulting with the service over their operations with helicopters in the state of Nebraska and their interaction with migratory whooping cranes. And the outcome of that effort and likely impending biological opinion, I think, will have some relevance to other installations within the flyway, primarily Air Force. And so we're kind of keeping an eye on that, and certainly will make everyone aware of what the eventual outcome of that consultation is in Nebraska and what potential impacts that might have on other services and other installations.
Hey, this is Kyle Rona in Kansas City District. I had a quick question. I'm actually a guy trying to fill Hoover's shoes and have the opportunity to be our environmental stewardship business line manager. And, with that, with all this, recovery work or habitat management work, it kind of requires funding. Do you guys have any suggestions? I believe I've seen some specific work packages come through for whooping cranes here in the last year or two, but you guys have any suggestions or tips on how to get, more funding for this type of stuff?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, like with a lot of other species that we deal with, our funding primarily goes towards, reacting to biological opinions, or if we're undertaking a project and have to write an EA or a BA, that's where the funding gets directed. One of the things that I would really like to see the Corps and DOD do is direct some of the funding that eventually would go towards the 7A2 action into more proactive 7A1 actions. And 7A1 doesn't actually have, in most cases, a line item in the budget. And so it's more of a change in paradigm in how we address endangered species and getting more on the proactive side as opposed to the reactionary side of compliance. So, other than that, I don't have any real specific recommendations because it's a difficult thing to convince the powers that be and the funders that we need to be more proactive. But we're starting to show that type of approach is the way to go, because it oftentimes leads to increased operational flexibility and ultimately and eventually leads to decreased costs. So if we can get that paradigm changed and start moving in that direction, we'll have a better opportunity to do some of these more proactive things for habitat management.
You're saying that Section 7A1 conservation plan was hopefully finalized here in this next year?
Yes, I would say in the next 12 months we'd like to have it done and wrapped up.
Okay, so it could be something we could in the future reference, for support to some of these funding, some of these special work packages or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, Rich. One other potential option is looking into one of the programs that's funded through headquarters and then goes through ERDIC, such as the EMRRP, the Ecological Restoration Program. And so if there's a number of districts that, have similar needs throughout the flyway, then there may be a need to potentially submit a statement of need towards an effort. So just something to keep in mind there. And if you need additional resources and are not familiar with that process, feel free to reach out to Rich or I, and we can provide more details on it.
There is a comment from Jeremy Adams. Hey, Jeremy. In the 5 years he was in Texas doing bird counts, they didn't document any cranes on Navy installations. And I'm sure that's probably true. And, for the military installations, especially Navy and Air Force, we're not really in the business of trying to attract large-bodied birds because of the bird aircraft strike hazard risk. And so, I don't think we're going to try to promote whooping crane habitat per se on some of those installations, especially with large flying missions. And so, but there are opportunities for some installations, perhaps Fort Hood, as Jake mentioned, to do some proactive things that are not going to be in conflict with the flight mission.
All right, at this time, we'll ask if there are any last questions. Hearing none, I just wanted to pass along another thanks to both Rich and Jake for this presentation. It's very informative and very interesting to see the work that is going on and the potential that it holds for USACE projects to provide the habitat that's needed for this species. So thank you very much. With that, I will close the webinar for today, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thanks, Tara. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Tara.